Jonestown was supposed to be this paradise. Everyone had a smile plastered on their face. People loved one another, they got along with their neighbours, and there was just mutual respect within the whole community. Who wouldn't want to sing and dance all night with their friends and their neighbours and basically have all of life's necessities paid for, like their rent, their food, their education? But there was one major problem with Jonestown, and that was the fact that the person running it was absolutely insane, and it turned into a death trap that nobody could escape. Before we get started, I'd just like to say hello, my name is Yasmin, and I make videos about topics that are scary or disturbing or true crime. I post once a week, so if you're interested, then please follow along and we'll get on with the rest of this story. James Warren Jones, also known as Jim Jones, was born in Crete, Indiana in 1933 to very emotionally absent parents. His dad was a World War I veteran, so psychologically he had a lot going on, which resulted in him being an alcoholic. Jim's mum was a nurse who worked constantly and was never really at home. Growing up, Jim had no support system in his life. It was just him, and he was pretty isolated because his parents would just kind of leave him to his own devices, and they were completely uninvolved in his life. To make matters even worse though, Jim grew up incredibly poor. They had a very small house, if you'd even call it that. It was more like a shack with no running water or electricity. His parents even struggled to provide basic necessities like food and clean clothes for Jim. Life was pretty rough, to say the least. At school, Jim's classmates noticed that he was a little bit weird. He had this bizarre obsession with death where he'd even abuse animals just so he could slowly kill them, and then he'd hold a funeral for them. And although he seemed a little bit off, he still seemed to be quite an intelligent child. He had this weird fascination with Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Karl Marx from a very young age, which was also a little bit bizarre. Things got much worse for Jim when his parents got a divorce though, and he was about 14 years old when this happened. It made him feel even more isolated because back then divorce wasn't really something that commonly happened. So it was sort of like, oh, your parents got a divorce, there must be something wrong with your family. During this time, an older man in the community who knew Jim approached him and he asked him whether he wanted to come over to the Pentecostal church. And of course Jim agreed because he was basically looking for anything to cling on to at this point. This church provided so much more than just religious guidance for Jim. This is where he developed a sense of belonging and acceptance by fellow churchgoers and by God. It finally felt like he was in a loving environment, and he really got hooked onto this feeling of community and feeling like he was important for once in his life. He was always in awe of the church preachers, and he loved how they were this dominant, godlike figure that people really looked up to and listened to. He wanted to be someone like that himself. He wanted to be in a position of power where everyone looked up to him. Jim's life slowly started to improve. He started working a part-time job as an orderly at a hospital during his last few years of high school, and that's where he met his wife, Marceline, who was a nursing student at the time. They did end up getting married after high school when he was 19 years old and Marceline was 22 years old. After their marriage though, I think he felt like it was a safe place to admit this to someone, but he talked to Marceline one day and he actually said he wasn't a Christian man. He was an atheist, and he wanted to use the church to infiltrate people's minds about living in a socialist community. He would also attend all these secret meetings about communism that was happening all over America at this point, but it was really a no-no. Like, they were really trying to crack down on people who would go to these meetings, and they didn't really want anyone to be a communist at that time. But even though he supported communism, he somehow was still allowed to become a youth pastor at a Methodist church with no official training. He didn't last very long though, because one thing he really didn't like about the church was the way that they were all segregated. So at the time there were white churches and black churches, and they really just didn't mix. People didn't do that. But Jim wanted to integrate people of all racial backgrounds in one place to form a community, but this was just not a popular thought back then. To recruit followers, he had a few tricks up his sleeve. He learned how to do telepathy and healing, so he drew lots of attention to himself, but he'd also have these intense live performances where he would supposedly cure some of the worshippers of their cancer by using that like chicken bone removal trick where they like sort of look into the stomach and they pull a tumor out, but it's actually a chicken bone that he had up his sleeve. So this created a little bit of traction, and he was starting to develop quite a following, especially in the black community. By 1955, he was on his way to forming his own church, and the first congregation he formed was called the Wings of Healing, and this later transformed into the People's Temple, which was based in Indianapolis. He ended up relocating his church from Indianapolis to California though, because he found that California was just a lot more progressive and that people were a lot more accepting of the fact that there was mixes of races at this church, whereas in Indianapolis didn't really fly with the people there, so he left. Over time though, Jim started to act quite strange. The general public were starting to catch on to this weirdness too. For example, he'd start coercing his followers to pay their full income to the church, and he even convinced them to sell their houses and major assets and put all that money towards the church, apparently to help the church with resources and to help build a commune. By the 70s, he actually had a pretty decent following. It was in the thousands that people were worshipping him, essentially. But because of the public speculation and all of that, he really just didn't want to be in the public eye, so he moved his church from California to Guyana. He found a small remote area in Guyana, which was basically in the middle of the forest, and he decided, yep, this is where we're going to build the church and the community from now on. So he also changed the church's name to the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but it was also known as Jonestown. You could fly to Guyana, so you'd fly to the capital city, which was Georgetown, and then you'd have to catch a little plane over to the very remote area where he was setting up the community. So it basically isolated them from any sort of outside world, which he really wanted to do. Since he had such a big following and so many people loved him, he actually had many worshippers in the hundreds move over from the United States to Guyana to live in this rural community with Jim. Without any eyes from the public, Jim was pretty much free to do whatever he wanted, and the weirdness continued and things just started to get really wild. Initially, life in Jonestown started off somewhat nice. They had multiple little houses that were made of natural materials, and there was even a medical center, a daycare, a school. Everything was really taken care of for the people that were living in Jonestown. They didn't have to worry about food, clothes, or any basic necessities either. Jim provided everything. But there was one condition, and this was a pretty major condition. Everybody had to work 6 days a week for at least 12 hours a day. All the money that they got paid from working there went straight back into the community, so they were actually not paid anything really. They had to live off Jim. They were completely reliant on him. There were also reports of members getting severely beaten. Food was scarce sometimes because, they were in the middle of nowhere. They had to import all of their food. And if anyone even mentioned the fact that they wanted to leave Jonestown and go back to the US, Jim would lose it. In fact, he called it blasphemy wanting to leave Jonestown, just making people feel really awful for wanting to go back and see their family. Everything was monitored, so the incoming and outgoing letters, there were no phone calls that were allowed, and there was to be no contact with any outsiders. He created a community where he was basically this god, and he provided everything for his people. They completely relied on Jim for everything in their lives. These members started to believe that Jim was their savior, and he was the reason why they were alive in the first place. This was their life's mission, apparently, to live in this community with Jim. He'd preach for hours on end, and then he'd prepare this juice, which was like a flavor aid. It was one of those drink concentrate things that you'd mix with water. He'd basically make everyone have this juice. So women, children, babies, elderly, everyone you could think of in this hall had to have some of this juice. Once he was sure that everyone had this juice, he would just say that it was poisoned and that everyone was going to die within an hour. This obviously sent people into a massive frenzy, well, some of the people anyway, and it allowed Jim to identify who was wanting to leave and who was truly devoted to him and wanted to stay. After he sort of had a general idea of what was going on, he would just say that, oh, actually the juice wasn't laced with poison, he was just testing their devotion. What normal person would do that? Back in the States, the family members of the people who traveled to Jonestown were starting to get a little bit suspicious as to what was actually happening. I mean, they just left the States just to fly over to another country in a really remote area, and they can't really get in contact with these people that went there. So they informed government officials, and they said that they wanted to have an investigation of Jonestown. They formed a group of people called the Concerned Relatives Group. This group somehow did get the attention of the government, and in November of 1978, a small group of congressmen, photographers, and news reporters flew to Guyana to investigate the community. When they got there, Jim didn't actually allow them to enter the community immediately. He was a little bit on edge, and he only let about 3 or 4 people in at one time. The news reporters spoke to some of the community members who all actually seemed to be loving being in Jonestown. All the videos that they took showed that everyone had a smile on their face, they were laughing, singing, dancing. It looked like a place that everyone wanted to be, really. But there was one major red flag. Some of the people that they interviewed, to the camera, they would say how much they loved the place and how much they didn't want to leave, but then someone slipped them some notes, which basically said they want to get out, but they can't get out. Please set them free. When Jim was questioned about this, he basically brushed it off and he was like, they're free to leave whenever they want to leave. I'm not keeping anybody here against their will. The next day, the congressmen that were visiting from the States came back to the village to visit them one last time before they flew back. And there was a small subset of community members that actually saw this as an opportunity to escape and outright said that they're leaving with the government officials. Jim, of course, didn't make it obvious, but this was making him super nervous about the whole situation. There was no resistance to them leaving because this would obviously set off some alarm bells. When it was time to leave, all the community members gathered to say goodbye to the ones that were leaving for good and the US officials. But just before they hopped on a truck to leave the area, one of the congressmen was targeted by a really angry community member, and it was this guy that was charging at him with a knife. But luckily people stopped him, they sort of jumped on him and prevented him from stabbing the congressman. But this was another red flag that something sketchy was going on here. The government officials, TV crew, camera crew, along with the small group of people that were escaping from Jonestown, had finally made it to that small strip of tarmac where they were waiting for their plane to arrive so that they could finally leave this place. While they were waiting though, a truck came in, and this truck had a lot of angry community members in it, and they all opened fire on everybody on the tarmac. They ended up shooting and killing 4 of the group members that came from the States. At the same time that this was all happening, Jim quickly got into action, like he'd been planning this all along. He called an emergency meeting, and every single community member had to attend this meeting, where he declared that all of their lives were actually in danger and that the congressmen were going to be sent over from America to violently kill them all. But he told them not to panic because death was the only solution to this. They were either going to get killed violently or they were going to die in peace with Jim and his support and guidance. With the help of some doctors who were also part of Jim's community, he made a huge bulk of grape-flavored flavor aid, which was very similar to the ones that he would make on white nights. except this one was laced with cyanide and Valium. He told the crowd what was actually in it and that there was poison in it, but that they had to drink this drink so that they would leave this world peacefully within an hour. The whole speech that he made was actually recorded while everyone was drinking their grape-flavored Flavorade, and it's crazy. You can actually hear people cheering in the recording. Some of the community members tried to escape, but when they tried to do that, there were armed guards hidden in the jungle that would just inject them against their will with poison so that they couldn't leave. The people really had no choice. Every single person was to drink this drink, including babies and children. In the recording, it's really sad. You can even hear babies screaming and children crying about how disgusting the drink is in the first place. But Jim just kept egging them on. He declared that they were committing revolutionary suicide. Within an hour, all of the members of Jonestown were dead. 909 people, including Jim, who actually didn't drink the juice. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Even the guards were dead, who also had the punch concoction. I haven't actually included any photos just out of respect, but if you want to look it up, I just want to warn you that the aftermath does look quite disturbing. Most of the bodies were brought back to the States. Around 400 bodies were buried in Oakland Evergreen Cemetery. Some of them were cremated or buried in a family cemetery. And that was the story of what happened in Jonestown. If you found this video interesting, then please subscribe and follow along. I post every single week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.